Well, that's good. Then we have other questions we can ask you, and we don't have to worry about the people that aren't really that familiar with the Constitution or.
I think that's, yeah.
That's good, because I do have a few questions.
Well, then let's go for it.
Well, did you want to, how do we do it? Yours first, or I don't know, how many wants to do this?
I mean, I don't know if you want to go through.
Richard, yeah, I want to hear what you have to say.
Because what I did is I put together a seminar for it was going through the progressive era, which was generally from 1890 to 1920, and during the progressive era, the unions got a big boost because basically the progressives came out of the union and the union came out of the progressivism. I mean, it's all one. There was no separation between union and progressive movement. It was the same. And I'm going to show how that happened and who the players were.
Who to blame?
And basically the same things I'm going to show you tonight are still the exact same things that we have today as far as issues go. I wanted to start by pledging allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Amen. Can you do it manually?
I can. I'm just looking for my laser beam pointer.
It's funny, I'm not using my arm for the month because I had rotator cuff surgery. It's like, I feel like I'm a stroke victim the way I have to be so deliberate and I can't write. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Excellent.
Good evening, everybody, and I do thank everybody that's here for being here. Tonight, we're going to cover the progressivism in the West, and just so for tonight's purposes, whenever we use the word West, it means the entire United States. That we're known as the Western world. It doesn't mean necessarily like me when I first started putting this together. At first I thought West meant west of the Mississippi River. but the people across the pond generally categorize us as the Western way of life. So you're going to see the word West a lot, so just to refer that as the whole country of the United States as we knew it back in those days. And during the progressive movement, which went from about 1890 to 1920, we're also going to be looking at how big labor was influenced with the progressive movement. Progressives also, in the very beginning, there wasn't much. Progressives were both both Republicans and Democrats. There wasn't so much as a one party as it is today. That we still have a few progressive Republicans, but the numbers are few in comparison. Back in those days, it was about 50-50. That progressives were heavily influenced in both the Republican and Democratic Party, and it affected a lot of the policy making that went on during that time too. The origins of the progressive movement were to the reaction to the extremes of modern life. That the Western Federation of Miners was formed in 1892. And they were constantly having to do battle with the corporations against the miners. And so one of the things that they wanted to do was to take away the extremes to kind of make everybody on a level playing field. And then another component of the origins of the labor movement was urbanization, as far as people moving out of the outskirts of town, how communities used to be. People who were wealthy actually lived in the center of town. Mm-hmm. And then industry was located on the outskirts of the town. And then the poorer you were, money-wise and living standards, the closer you were to the outskirts, that a lot of the poorer people were living in the alleyways in between the businesses, whether it be lumber mills or mines or whatever type of businesses were around. And what the progressives wanted to do was to put the businesses into the center of the community and have the people live on the outskirts. And that was one of the things that happened, but typically every town at one point, the center of town was basically where the homes were, where it's sort of just the flip-flop. It's the opposite of the way things are today.
That's how it is in South America. The rich people live in the middle, and the poor all surround it.
All surround on the outskirts.
Yes.
And then the factories are on the outskirts as well, on the very further outskirts.
Do you know why they wanted to do that? What was the ultimate purpose of it? Did they think it would equal a lot? It would make everything more equal because everybody was living in the center of town or something?
Well, the progressives, their goal was to always be meddling into the lives of people. I have some examples of what they would do, but basically, if they went out into an area that had farmland, they would say that there's too many farmers, we need to bring some industry out here. And then if they went into an area that was all industrialized, they say this area is too industrialized, we got to bring some farms into here.
That's
So
their
it's like
idea
planning.
of making it equal or something?
Or they just like changing things for the sake.
Contrarian.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're just contrary?
But that's basically what the progressives do, and they're still doing it today in different ways, but they don't like complacency. They always have to be upsetting the apple cart constantly. They're never happy with the way things are, even if things are great. It's not to them. And they use their radical issues as far as, they're in the name of environmentalism or whatever to justify what they're doing when it really doesn't have anything to do with what they're doing. But so that pretty much covers the urbanization, industrialism. Then there was always labor conflict as far as paying wages, and that's when we had collective bargaining came into place, the environmentally exploitation. There again, I think they weren't really true environmentalists, but they had to keep coming up with reasons for doing what they're doing.
I was going to say, I wouldn't have thought during that period that environmental exploitation would have been a real valid complaint, because we did not really contemplate what we were doing.
Was bad for the environment.
We didn't know the extensive effects of some of the things we were doing.
Right, because it was all brand new. I mean, it was slavery had just ended. We're in the year 1890, and we're having this big boom going on. And the progressives and big labor are one. Labor, it's hard to say whether labor came out of the progressives, or did the progressives come out of the labor move, big labor, because the two of them are intertwined. And they always have been since the movement began. So I believe back then that they were just using it as a label or a reason just to upset the apple cart. The whole idea is they always wanted to put layers of regulation. They wanted to make it hard for businesses to do business. Now, I could be talking about today too, but that's how it was back in 1890, that the progressives didn't like big corporations. They thought they were evil.
Speaking to that, if I may, you'll notice that the 1903 convention is where we added prohibitions on monopolies to our Constitution.
Really?
Yep.
Because Teddy Roosevelt, I'm going to get into that a little bit later, he started doing what was called trust busting, where he was, where he saw businesses getting too big and thought it was the job of the government to break them apart. So we also, we had massive immigration, citizen and rights, and social problems as far as addiction to drugs, alcoholism, which, there again, the same problems they had back then we're still having today, but would they really be problems if they weren't being done strictly for the purpose of exploitation? The characters of progressivism was, one was the middle class morality, that the progressives couldn't stop the middle class from forming. This really bothered the progressives because prior to the industrial age, there were only two types of people. There were either the people who were really rich or the people that were really poor. There weren't very many people in the middle. But the middle class, by default of the Industrial Revolution, started to appear because both the parents were working, they were earning wages, which was never happened before. And the progressives couldn't stop it from forming, but once they felt that it was their duty to interfere, to work towards what they would call middle-class morality, having the perfect race that we had at that same time period, Margaret Sanger with the birth control movement. So while the Industrial Revolution was going on, they were trying to sterilize the people that they considered inferior and creating the perfect race, and they called it middle-class morality was the label for that.
And the social engineering that was actually going on back then.
Right. We started the eugenic movement here in the United States. I mean, I know Mao Zedong did, and Bush, the Russian Revolution, but those were done for revolutionary purposes. We were doing it for, we were doing it mainly to build our society, because we weren't at war with ourselves anymore. This is post-Civil War. That they wanted sexual purity using science, and we were trying to develop what was called the perfect Nordic race here in the United States. A Nordic person, the perfect race would have been blonde hair, blue-eyed, 5'10" to 6'2".
Sounds like something somebody else tried
Yes.
to do.
Exactly, but where do you think? I don't like to say that the idea came from here, but there's too much evidence and proof that what Hitler did in Germany was a direct reflection on us, because he invited Margaret Sanger to come to Germany and share her thoughts and her views. And he was a big fan of Walter Lippmann, who was the propaganda expert for the Woodrow Wilson campaign that Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's,
Oh, man.
Yeah.
who was Hitler's propaganda man, was in contact with Walter Lippmann with the Woodrow Wilson, and the two of them were always talking with each other too, so we shared a lot of ideas. Well, the early communism did. And that was the scientific expertise assimilation, which is known as social Darwinism, that pioneered social work to help people who are socially disadvantaged to produce and contribute to society. That they tried to take the people who basically were living on the outskirts of town, and instead of being on welfare, they actually tried to fit them into doing different jobs to see if they could contribute to the society. And that was part of the assimilation. You know, today's social workers and department, and this, what they were doing was a precursor to today's social workers that we have in Department of Family Services, which intrudes on people's lives, which basically they want to intrude on people's lives who are less fortunate than others.
So this was all, you're saying that all this was happening in the 1800s?
The
Late 1800s, yeah.
1890 through 1920.
And
Wow.
that the federal role was the precursor to family services that we have today. And Christian action and humanitarianism, that the humanism of extremism, that the Christians saw that true charity began at home. But the progressives were arguing that it's the government's job to take care of charity, and the churches said, no, we can take care of our people ourselves. We don't need the government to take care of the people. It's supposed to be neighbors doing it, not the government. And that argument started a long time ago, and today we're still talking about the same topics, just in a different era. Professionalism of work, that was the bureaucratization of politicians to choose their own school employees and teachers, that when it came, we didn't have a Department of Education back then, but the progressives wanted to, teachers got appointed by the progressives to work, you know, and the professionalism of work and the organizational impulse, which is also the progressive monopoly, you know, created oppression, they created racism, child welfare. It's also known as economic injustice of the late 1800s. And its organizational impulse was to fight and overcome the inequalities of life through government. That's what the progressive agenda was, versus through the churches and neighbors and families taking care of each other. Then we have these economic extremes, the corporate control of industry and resources. You know, that the progressives fought to take control of the private sector, that they didn't like big corporations, and they thought that they should be running them, not the people who started them, who actually took a risk with their own capital to hopefully be able to create jobs and to make a profit for themselves. Then we had Rockefeller and Standard Oil, which was one of the first major big corporations we had. Carnegie, who was a Scottish immigrant who built a steel empire in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is part of the U.S. Steel. Weyerhaeuser was a progressive radical, also known as the father of environmental issues. He was Al Gore's precursor. He started the environmental issue as far as when they were clearing areas for timber, they were trying to regulate where the lumber company can get their lumber from, and But we tended to take care of ourselves because the people who were harvesting lumber knew that if they didn't plant new trees from the areas they were
Right.
taking lumber from, that they were going to run out of wood. Well, not really, but you know, they would have to keep moving their locations of their lumber mills.
Just, that's an interesting tie-in. Because do you know what Weyerhaeuser is? Weyerhaeuser is one of the larger timber harvesters and pulp and paper manufacturers.
I didn't know that. When
I only know that because of my industry.
I mean, I believe it, but
But so what you have was somebody who was using alleged environmental issues to give themselves an economic advantage using government.
Yes.
exactly. Which is basically what progressives are doing today, too. That they're writing their own rules in order to justify what they're doing. And then we had the big four railroads, which were Lee, Stanford, Colin Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker were the four big entrepreneurs. Each one of them owned we had 4 different railroad lines in the late 1800s, and we had about 150,000 miles of railroad going across the United States, crisscrossing, going north and south, and they were basically owned by 4 different corporations. And in order to accomplish that, they would have to have political influence in with the government. And then there was also part of the economic extremes was that the progressives were anti-capitalist, that they didn't think that the big corporations should be allowed to make the money they were making, that after they made so much money, they felt that the rest of it should go to the government. And there were anti-private sector that they thought that the progressives again thought that the unions should be controlling the businesses because they are the union. As I move on to the slides, we're going to move in, start seeing what we see today as union activity, but that came out of the progressives.
Is that supposed to be Roosevelt and Carnegie?
Yes.
Yeah, who's the snakehead?
The snakehead, I believe,
The one on the right.
was Rockefeller, because
Old man Rockefeller.
Old
okay.
man Rockefeller, John D.
Okay.
Rockefeller, the very first one.
Yes.
Because he changed the way our world is today. Because when he was sucking up oil from the ground, he thought that everything that came out of the ground should have a use. Because when you drill for oil, you get more than just oil coming out of the ground. And he was trying to find different uses. And up until Rockefeller, everybody used whale oil to light their lamps at nighttime. And Rockefeller found, and kerosene was very expensive because they didn't have cheap ways to refine the kerosene that comes out of the oil wells. And because Rockefeller had a lot of money, he spent a lot of money to come up with a way to make kerosene cheaper than whale oil. And he put and basically he saved the lives of a lot of whales because it normally would have been waste that was thrown away that came out of the oil wells. He found a use for it in turning it into kerosene to light oil lamps. And in a way, he was doing things good. And he also, when they started manufacturing gasoline and oil, he sold his oil cheaper than anybody else did. He sold these poor people who at nighttime didn't have any money because they couldn't afford whale oil. Back then, we're now able to buy cheap kerosene and they were able to have lanterns in their house at nighttime when normally after the sun goes down, they didn't have any light. So he was helping out the poor as well by having his prices lower than anybody else. But all the other corporations were complaining to President Roosevelt, so he thought it was his job to dismantle Rockefeller, try to dismantle him, so everybody else can have their fair share. That he was trying to disrupt the supply side of the economics. I mean, if somebody else wanted to sell oil, let them do what Rockefeller did and come up with a way where they can manufacture it and sell it cheaper. I mean, that's what happens when the government interferes with the private sector. I mean, in other cases, the A&P supermarkets that used to be around 25 years ago, they were the largest grocery chain in the United States. And I forget which president busted up A&P because they were too big, and now there's just like a handful of stores left across the United States.
Yeah, they were big back in the 50s when I was little.
They're the largest in the United
Wasn't
States.
Nixon, was it?
No, I must have been.
Maybe Carter?
Mm,
Because they were still big when I was
oh, I see.
in my teens.
I thought they went down
Well, they
They're
did,
more, you
Before
see
that.
them more in the South. than
before
you do.
Carter.
they did go down.
Johnson?
Maybe Johnson. Yeah.
Because they did go down because when they broke up the supermarkets, the reason why they were doing so well is because they had so many of them that they were buying in such volumes that they were able to do lower prices.
Yeah, their
I mean,
prices.
like Walmart.
Like Walmart.
Yeah.
They're like the first, and what happened was because you busted up the corporations, now when they buy, they're buying in smaller quantities, and so that was harder for them to compete. So a lot of them ended up going out of business because they were broken up by the government. And this just shows, you know, how the progressives thought of big oil back in 1906. And then we had the railroad grants. Of 1900 to be able to expand further out on the western side of the Mississippi.
The miners in West Virginia and Virginia aren't too happy right now with the progressives.
So, bear with me for a second, I just had notes. But we did have, like I said, the economic extremes where the Western Federation of Miners, which was a union, which was part of the progressives, which formed in 1892. And then by 1901, we had a socialist union.
Wow.
And also, some of the top concerns they had was health insurance, establishing a wage, working conditions, daily self-help, and community support. But they wanted to tax the rich in order to accomplish all this, that they wanted to fund it by going after the corporations to make them pay for their agenda.
So that's how healthcare got tied in with industry. Instead of like auto insurance, you go on the corner and you buy it.
Right. It started off with the progressives that thought it was up to the big companies to support,
Because they called it hospitalization back in the day.
because the health care that they had back then isn't like it is of today. And what we have today isn't going to be like it's going to be for 10 years from now.
Let's hope.
And we had the International Workers of the World, which is still in existence. It started in 1905. Well, International Workers of the World, that was there was a myth behind it, because they really didn't represent the international workers of the world, but they did it. And people thought that because they called themselves the international workers of the world, they thought they were. Which in 1905 in Chicago and the West, that there were a union for all workers. It was founded by Big Bill Hayward and Mother Jones in Chicago, which I'll get into that. It was also nicknamed the Wobblies Union, which is very extreme and a controversial union. Most libraries do not carry info on this union because they were highly radical and extreme for back in their time. That they're a very, I would say, forceful type of a union for that era.
Threatening to kill people or
Pretty
harm
much.
No, like the 1930s and 40s.
them?
It all started a lot sooner. Then we had the Western timber industry, which started off in 1917 in Idaho and Washington. Well, it's been around for a long time, but when the progressives and the unions got a hold of it was in 1917, that they combined labor and lumber, that the workers had to pay 45 cents per month in order to work there, that they had to give the union bosses part of their pay. That they didn't go, that if they didn't pay the union boss, they not only didn't work, but they would have ended up in a hospitalization plan someplace with broken legs and broken arms.
45 cents, that's a pretty big amount for back then.
Back then, that was a monthly fee, and that was to show that they were loyal and worthy of having their job. And during that era, we had the migrant sedentary workers. World War I came into play. The National Guard was formed. The progressives negotiated an 8-hour workday, and there was also there was a time when government was going against unions for a short period of time. It was after Teddy Roosevelt, but they were actually, it wasn't the progressives that did the 8-hour workday like they claim. It was actually, done by executive, not executive order, it was done by a bill that was passed in Congress. But the unions say it was them that did it, but it was actually, they took the credit for it, but they weren't the ones who started it. And also, too, when they went on attack, we tried to jail the union leaders, and at one point we made them criminalized. And then the copper mining had the same problems. That was owned by the Phelps Dodge Corporation in the early 1900s. That Arizona was the capital of copper mining. And they had their shares of battles with ethnic and racial divides, strikes, and people being deported out of the United States, because we had a lot of people that were here illegally working in copper mines and throughout the country.
Oh, it just changed.
And then we had the forced march from Bisbee, Arizona. That was the deportation of progressive radicals herded into, basically we marched them into filthy boxcars that were used for cattle. And the train would go into New Mexico, but there'd only be like about 15 or 20 miles of train track going into New Mexico, and there was no more train track. And basically, when we pushed them into New Mexico, the caboose was able to turn around, and then, not the caboose, the locomotive, and they'd take off, leaving everybody stranded in New Mexico in boxcars. Did you get them out of the state?
So you mean they loaded up the progressives? Who was doing that? Not the government, right?
Well, the government of Arizona.
The government of Arizona
The
was.
government of Arizona was.
Because back then, states still had their rights. Well, not 100%. States lost their rights through the, I think it was through the Commerce Clause, because there was a question with the railroads, like when a train goes through Massachusetts then into New York State, does the train have to stop at every state and collect money? Or does the government allow it to travel across from one side of the country to the other without having to pay each state as you go through, and do it in a way of taxation? And that kind of, I forget what the exact name of that act was. It's in the Constitution, but that's how it got ruined. That was the first downfall of the states' rights, because the states didn't have any say on when they laid railroad tracks across the country. We lost our sovereignty because the train was able to go freely from one state to the other. And the amount of money that was being reimbursed was set by the federal government and not by the states. And I forget what clause it was in. And then we had Mother Jones, who was another progressive and union member. In Colorado, that in the oil and iron business, which was owned by John Rockefeller, that she struck against the Fuel and Iron Corporation, and she was thrown into jail. She was born in Ireland, and she also organized the Knights of Columbus and formed the United Mine Workers Union. And she was one of the early women for the suffrage movement. Then we had the Ludlow Massacre, which was a bloodbath that lasted for about 10 days. There was an attack by the Colorado National Guard on 1,200 striking coal miners that refused to go back to work. And there were a mixture of Greek, Slavic, and Italian miners and women. The unions ended up losing, and they all got replaced by non-union workers. But there were over 1,200 people that were killed throughout that battle. And this was in the early 1900s.
Now, do you know when that was? Okay, you said 1917?
1917 in Ludlow, Colorado.
And that was during the First World War? This was going on?
Yeah, it must have been.
That's
Yeah.
weird.
No, it's not.
They got away with it.
That's one of the things that shifted us from state militias to a National Guard.
Huh.
And the militias that we had, they had like tent cities. And what they did is they refused to leave, so the militia just went in and ripped down the tents and ended up killing an additional 39 people, which were basically women and children who were in the tents because their husbands were either working or they got killed in a massacre that happened prior to this. And the survivors again were deported. And when we say deported, because it's such a mixture of people, they were just too radical, unionized and progressive people, that the corporations in the state still had more power. They would put them on a one-way train ride to the end of the railroad tracks into a state that wasn't really settled yet, that similar to like New Mexico was a good dumping place at one time, that they would just leave them, out in the middle of nowhere in a filthy cattle car and take off.
And who was doing this? The states?
The
corporations.
corporations.
For
But the
those
state,
who were striking?
but it was the state government that was anti-union and anti-progressive, because they were killing their industry, which produced money that they used to create jobs. And the progressives were demanding too much out of the corporations, where that the corporations would go bankrupt if they had to give them everything that they were looking for in addition to their work.
So where do we deport them now?
We don't.
You don't, that's the problem. And these they made a big deal about the Ludlow refugees because the progressives from other parts of the
Right,
country
yeah.
wanted them to be victims, not necessarily the cause of the problem, but look what the big evil corporations did to these poor
Right,
people.
yeah.
You know, it's sort of like Nancy Pelosi saying, because we don't want to fund a Planned Parenthood, there's going to be women dying on the floor
Yeah.
everywhere you look. And that was just a couple of days ago, I believe. You know, the Republicans want women dying on the floor. I mean,
Come on.
it's time for her to go back home to San Francisco.
Yeah.
It's really fun, not funny, but you know, in the middle of tough times, Nancy Pelosi's net worth back in the beginning of 2010, her and her husband, was $12 million, and at the end of 2010, it was $28 million. That her net worth went from 12 million to 28 million in 1 year.
When everybody else is.
And you think about all that bailout money that people didn't quite know where that money
Where it
went.
Really?
Well, her husband's on the board of Star-Kissed Tuna, and they actually got some of the bailout money for
I heard about
to
this.
fund the illegal immigrants who are working for Star-Kissed Tuna here in the United States.
And she got the exemption in changes to the minimum wage for their factory in Guam?
Samoa.
Samoa.
Right?
Wow.
And then her husband also sits on the board of a local bank in San Francisco, and that bank got a bailout as well.
Yep.
Who is
So
this?
what happened is we went to popularism. That's the precursor to the progressive movement. They went, being a populist sounds more fun than being a progressive.
Well, if you're getting put on a boxcar and left out in the middle of nowhere, I guess so.
Right, and and they were against the corporate domination. They were the political party of apathy. They're of agrarian discontent, which
What does that mean?
agrarian is where agrarian is where big labor and progressives, big corporations and progressives intersect. That point of intersection is known as agrarian. Agrarian is when you have big corporations and then the progressives butting heads. It was called. So they had agrarian discontent, which means they weren't able to form a bond. They weren't able to
Make a working
make
relationship.
a working relationship with the corporations.
No, what's the Grange?
Granger, that's the people out in the rural areas would form, the farmers would all get together.
It's basically a farmers union.
Yeah,
Right, which were
It
it was
basically
very big in Texas.
the communists went out there because a lot of your progressives were communists. And,
Because I see them at the fair all the time. I always wondered what a Grange was.
Yeah, it's just getting, the farmers get together and
Collectively
make
bargain.
their,
it was
make their demands and
it was
set prices.
because the way when I was looking it all up, it was known as a populist movement known as the Patrons of Husbandry. It was more like a secret society among farmers with secret handshakes and rituals.
Oh my
And
gosh.
there were many orders throughout the West, so that there were lots of different Grange names. But basically, there were, if you were in that society, it was illegal, and you can go to jail or prison for being part of it. So that's why they had secret handshakes, and they met at nighttime, without, in secret locations, which became the Farmers Alliances, which was part of the Populist Party and was Democrat and community oriented. And we had the Western Populist, which were the rural cooperatives, which are known as the Farmers Unions and also known as the People's Party. Local control over the resources, that the unions and the progressives wanted control over the coal, copper, timber, and all the industries that were going on. The silver and tariffs was a tax imposed by the progressives in order to sell the silver. Jerry Simpson, he organized a labor party known as the Greenback, and he went to Congress in D.C., and he was the party's congressional leader. We had Mary Elizabeth Lease, who was a progressive known as Queen Mary and Mother Lease. She was part of the early suffrage movement, and she declared war on Wall Street in 1888, as big business were making people slaves, and big business and corporations were slave masters, and anybody who worked for one of those evil corporations were slaves.
Sound familiar?
Yes.
And then we had the Omaha Platform, which was the launching of the Populist Party in Omaha, Nebraska on July 4th of 1892. Their platform was a new version of the Constitution, that they actually took the Constitution we had and tried to write their own Constitution, which was part of the Omaha Platform, that they thought that the old version of the Constitution was outdated back in 1892.
Well, that's what Wilson, if you read what Wilson wrote way before he became president, he wanted to change the Constitution because he felt it wasn't what the country needed.
And
that makes sense.
I would say that the ink wasn't even dry when the Constitution was ratified, when you had the evil forces already here in the United States that were looking to change it. That within the first 6 years after, I think the first 6 or 8 years after the Constitution was signed, the government already had quadrupled in size, within 10 years after the ratification of the Constitution, and it was already starting to grow, bigger than what the forefathers originally wanted it to do. And then William Jennings Bryan, he was a dominant force in the liberal wing of the Democratic Party in the 1890s in Washington, and he was an enemy to big banks, to the gold mines, to the railroad. He was the 41st U.S. Secretary, Department of Labor, and he served under the Woodrow Wilson administration. So it all connects to Woodrow Wilson or to Teddy Roosevelt during that particular era. And the main populist library was in Kansas City, because a lot of their material was too radical for the public to view, that they had their own library just for their material and their work. There you had the confluence of trends and changes, which is the junction where progressives and conservatives intersect. That the corporate capitalism was blamed for a host of inequalities, that progressives were being elected to the Supreme Court to change the balance of power from the U.S. Constitution, that they thought there was too much corporate control over political life, and that the progressives, through political corruption, were trying to offset what we call the supply side of the economy to more of a government-centered economy. That the progressives wanted to redistribute income, and that was back during the Woodrow Wilson administration. We have progressive causes, which was the Statehood Party, which was also known as, which was a fancy name for the Progressive Party in early 1917. that under the territorial claims of the U.S. government, progressives wanted to make Puerto Rico a state so they can add them to the balance of the power versus being a territorial. But that didn't work out too good. They also started what was known as the Referendum Initiative Recall, which was an amendment made where they're able, if you get some, each state has their own rules, but that's all about like what they tried to do in Wisconsin when they tried to recall some of those Congress people and vote them out because of what happened. That all started. That all started under the in 1917.
Yeah, some of our western states actually have that. They have recall and referendum where, like in the East, we don't have that.
Right.
It's done by state.
Yeah.
And
state as well.
Wisconsin was one of them. And
Maine has it too, right? I don't know if that, do they have recall? They have referendum. I don't know if they
Don't know.
have recall. But they have initiative and referendum.
It's supposedly more democratic, but then if you do that, there's not the checks and balance because you get, as you always say, Garrett, 51% of the population rules the other 49, and that's not.
Well, it depends on who you're recalling. I mean, one of the things that happens with the direct election of senators is that's someplace where if you're going to go democratic on the selection of senators, then you need to, because you now have individuals who are so unaccountable in their election, you need, it's not irrational to have some method of taking out somebody who deceived you. When you had senators elected by the state legislatures, the legislators have a much greater ability to know the character of the individual. So removal of a senator was not as big a deal. That said, the recall of federal senators was included in the original draft of the Constitution and removed because it was too democratic.
And also they, part of that cause is that they were trying to enact child labor laws because they didn't want anybody working under the age of 14 in industries like lumber mills, places where limbs that can get cut off, that there were some corporations that preferred child labor because they caught on quicker than adults did, and they had more energy than adults did, and they were more productive workers than adults. But they were also children, and through reform that they tried to say that kids should be in school learning, and that children shouldn't work until the age of 14 in the big industries. And then they were trying to force labor contracts for collective bargaining. And that was all done by Frank Morris, who was actually, he was an American novelist during the Progressive Era, that he attacked corporations as greed and evil in his publications. He wrote many books and came from a well-educated background, but he was sort of almost like a modern-day George Soros at the time, more of a philanthropist like Soros was.
What does NEB stand for?
NEB, that he was from Nebraska.
Ah.
I was going to say that.
Aha. Connection there? The
Yes.
Omaha platform.
Yeah.
The Omaha platform, which we just went over.
Yep.
And then we had the woman in progressives, excuse my voice, I got a little bit of water.